Hi, this is Paul. If you haven't watched the fringe encounter between Grim Grizz and Richard Rollin, you need to. And if you must stop this video to watch it, go stop this video and watch it. I know that's sort of YouTube insanity to tell people to stop watching my video and go watch another video, but this was a tremendous conversation on many levels. Now, what I'm going to do right now is what I often don't do, which is I am going to take about 6 minutes from Grim Grizz and Richard Rollin in here, and instead of sort of doing my commentary interstitially, I am just going to drop it in and let it play as such, where Richard is talking about his homeschool education method that he and his wife use for their children, and he's talking about synthesis and narrative. And then Grimm sort of picks up on that and picks up exactly on what I've been doing and why, well, even though I really never intended to try to re-educate those who have been imprisoned by television set, for those of you who are not aficionados in the Grim Grizz vocabulary, we are all part of a massive re-education program. And in some ways, I really loved what Richard talked about with respect to education in that video. And those of you who caught my Friday question and answer from Bridges of Meaning, I did quite a bit of ranting about education and some of what I learned by my wife and I homeschooling my own children, what I learned about children's formation and education, and what it means to actually use agape to grow up a living, breathing, healthy human being. And so this I think Roland rightly says that this is connected with Vervaekean relevance realization. And so I want to play this clip, and then after this clip, I'm going to dive into a video that I've been wanting to get at, which I thought was just absolutely outstanding. And of course, I just don't have time to give all of these videos the attention they deserve, but that's what I'm going to do.
Yeah. So and then the other thing that I'll mention is a really big part of this education is something called narration, which is kind of what I've been doing with you today. So whenever it starts out when children are very young, you just read a portion before they even learn to read. You read a portion of a story, or you read like a short, like a fairy tale or something, and then you say, "Now tell it back to me in your own words." It's not a test. There's no grade. And if they get something wrong, you don't correct them. You just say, tell it back to me in your own words, and then they narrate it back to you. As children get older, the narrations become longer and they start to become written, and this is how you learn to write. But initially, you're just telling things back. And this is how we do something called synthesis. So when we synthesize information, it's when we bring it into ourselves and we try to relate it to the other information we already have, right? And so by retelling something in your own words, you are synthesizing it, and also actually learning how to tell a story, by the way. You're synthesizing it, and you're relating it to the other information you already have. And so even my 6-year-old right now, one of my oldest son is 6, and he's already been doing narration for a couple of years, but also he grew up watching his older sisters do narration. So nobody even had to explain to him what it is. He just started doing it naturally. So when we read a gospel passage, or we read the life of a saint, or I'm just telling him about, events in the world and things like that, he will just narrate it back to me in his own words without being told to, because he's just synthesizing the information into kind of like his own. This is how this relates to all the other things that I know and that I've experienced and that I've learned. And this, I cannot stress how important this is and how difficult it is to do as an adult if you are not, if you haven't practiced. I went to a classical teacher's kind of like a week-long internship seminar kind of a thing. And it was in this method of education because it was right when we were about to start educating our oldest daughter. And but for the class time, what they were just doing was just reading from Charlotte Mason's books and then making us narrate the stuff we were reading back. And holy cow, was it exhausting to do as an adult if you don't have practice. Because what we're used to is just being given the information, right? I want to know something, so I Google it, right? As opposed to somebody saying, here's a lengthy and somewhat difficult passage. I want you to read it and then give it to me, like synthesize it into your own words on the fly and tell me what was important. Tell me what you noticed, right? But if you do this when they're young, before their minds have been just totally, eviscerated by the world that we
New
live in.
math.
If you do this, if you do this when they're young, then what they actually are learning is the habit of attention, right? And what they're learning is, what you guys sometimes call like relevance, realization, all the stuff. The ability to read something or to hear a story or to be presented with facts or something like that, and actually to pick through what are the important things here, and then to synthesize it into their own narrative and to connect it to the things that they've already experienced. So this is the most, I say, one of the most fundamental parts of this kind of education. So that's what we do. And along the way, obviously, you do all the, you hit all the subjects. Subjects are boring. Every sentence has one, but anyway, you hit all the subjects, and there's a way to do math this way, and there's a way to do
narrative math. Whoa,
Yeah,
whoa,
yeah,
we're not
yeah,
going there. No,
yeah.
steer away. Steer away.
Anyway, there's a way to you can use this method to teach anything, and actually, once you know it, you can use this method to learn anything. And this is how I learned to tell stories, and this is actually how I still do them. Is I will read an ancient text. Most of my reading is pre-modern stuff, so I'll read an ancient text, and then I'll try to write my own version of that story. And most of the world under starlight is that.
We got all these stories now. That's good.
Yeah, most of the world under starlight is, I read let's say like a 5th century apocalyptic text. Well, for me to really be able to understand how an apocalyptic text works, the only way to actually understand that is to try to write my own. And that's how, like, most of pretty much all the lore, the mythology and whatnot of the world under starlight, that's basically how it came to be. So
Fascinating, because like from the angle I see things now, what you're saying to me lands like, well, Vanderclay's basically doing narrative synthesis and teaching people how to do that, and that's why you see these little pop-up channels trying it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so.
It's like, so this world I live in now is multiplanar, and like all the people, like when they're not doing things in the physical world, spend a lot of time, they like basically go into this meditative state in front of a black altar that flashes lights all over them. And this is akin to me a little bit to entering through the wardrobe. And so now their attention is in this invisible place that is the corner and so much else. And so we're coming together and doing this re-education things somehow.
Now this episode 24 of After Socrates, this one really gripped me. And I'm just going to go into it because what Guy Sengstock does here is absolutely, I think, foundational, and it's deeply connected with what Grimm and Richard were talking about.
So the question is, why this? Why now? Why this? Why now? And of course, if you happen to connect it to this thing called the meaning crisis, that would be wonderful. But why this? Why now? And I don't want to speak to the question first. I want to propose it and hear what you all have to say. Whoever would like to go first. Given that we've just had this rich, not even taste, this rich drinking of what dialogos, dialectic and dialogos is. Why this? Why now?
Well, I would say this is not exhaustive, but I think it is. I want to see if I can distinguish that we're in a time in history where something's happened with relationship and communication, primarily due to the internet. that has never happened before.
Mm-hmm.
If we look at it like this, like before texting and emailing and answering machines, before all that, if you had to have exchange of information, you had to at least talk on the phone. You had to do it through relationship. Now there was, television and radio where there was one-way communication, receiving of it, but the exchange of information always involved relationality. And because of that, to function required out of necessity so much relationality just by virtue of functioning. I think the first sign of this, where it was used like this, right, was relationship and communication got uncoupled with the answering machine. Was the first time.
Mm-hmm.
And then it went into email.
Now I'm going to pause here. I just finished, those of you who, if you pay any attention to what I wear, now, as I continue to have yet another rabbit trail, a rabbit trail on a rabbit trail on a rabbit trail, some of you might be noticing the proliferation of blue shirts. There'll be another shirt just like this too, because sometimes when I find shirts that fit, I buy lots of them because finding them later is difficult. So I'm not just wearing the same shirt every day. I'm doing the Steve Jobs thing. I've got all these blue shirts in my closet now. Okay, back from the blue shirt. If you pay attention to what I'm wearing, I just finished my rough draft for Sunday. It's Friday afternoon. Mark is doing his navigating patterns thing, although on the Randos United channel, he's just giving this little sermonette on caring. So this is Friday afternoon for me, and Friday afternoon is, okay, I've got the sermon where I need to go. I'm looking at the clock. I know my wife is going to be waiting for me to get home, but I want to get something in the can for Monday. And if I get two things in the can, then I can have not only a rough draft on Saturday, but another video on Saturday and a video for Monday. So Friday afternoon is sort of like prime time for me. Can I spit out a couple of videos? I just finished the rough draft on Sunday, which is about the end of Paul's letter to 1 Corinthians. What Guy is talking about here with respect to relationality, true. Now, you go all the way back to Plato, who had questions about our capacity to use written language. Because already, to push Guy's argument back a little bit, already with written language, you're sort of divorcing communication from relationality. And the tensions are right there between Paul of Tarsus and the church at Corinth. And those tensions have been fascinating biblical scholars for a very long time because there's so much we don't know, even in the midst of so much that we do know. I think I was talking about that on the question and answer this morning. So, and Guy's point is that the distance is getting increasingly further, but as I talked about Richard Rowland's education of his children, and these are parents educating their children. I still haven't quite got my seating the way I want it. As it goes with the education of children, when parents homeschool, they get it really tight, and that those children really grow up in them in many respects. And if the parents are good, it can be good things, and if the parents are not good, it can be really bad. Most of the time, it's depending. I'm not going to go into the homeschool question right now, but what Guy is talking about here is so foundational and important, and this has been an issue which has been accelerating because of the internet.
And then texting and then social media and TikTok and with the answering machine was the first time. Mm-hmm. And then it went into email and then texting and then social media and TikTok and the multiple array of things, such that we're actually at a time where it's starting to occur for, like, say, the Gen X tradition, like the Gen Xers, or not Xers, is it Z? Showing my age. who don't have a memory before synchronistic communication, right, was optional, right? They don't even have a memory for that. Therefore, they don't even have it as it's almost like relationship on some level occurs as this unnecessary thing, right? That I just have
Right there. Relationship at some level is an unnecessary thing. Again, if you go back and you listen to Richard Rowland talk about how he homeschools his kids and the particular curriculum he's using, what he talked about is it's the personhood of the child that is forefront in the endeavor. The relationship is forefront in the endeavor. Luke thinks he can't be GPT'd. Well, Luke, I've got a certain little GPT in my head of you, Luke Thompson, and the relationality is key. And what happens when there's a divorce of this? What happens to a society? So Mark was talking about caring and emergence a little bit on his little Friday afternoon sermon. And when more and more of the population loses this extraordinarily common human thing, I did a little bit on Paralandra. One of the things I noticed about Lewis a couple of years ago, especially in his book, The Great Divorce. Now, The Great Divorce is kind of a hard book because he's citing all sorts of references to mid-century England that are just completely lost on the rest of us. But one of the things that rings clear, and it's also in Paralandra, is that all of these tiny little relational things mean a lot as they sort of compound and as they develop broadly in populations. You can think about how much oxygen a forest produces when just one tree doesn't do that much. And these tiny this is so often what mass technology does, is it sort of it impacts all the tiny little ecosystems in ways that we can't imagine because the world is just too complex.
happened to go on YouTube, and I saw a thing where it was a streamer, the guy who just streamed, just playing games and talks on YouTube all day, talked about his sex life. And he's like, why would I actually go out and have a real sex? That would mean I have to go out of my apartment and I'd have to go down and talk to people and go to the bar and then maybe meet somebody and bring them back. And then I'd have to take my clothes off. And it's like, I could just go to this Discord server and I've already broken my computer persona sex, right? I'm de-virginized there already.
His computer cherry, his internet cherry, let's say.
Why would I do all of that? So I think, and then if you also think about it, where we're also in a time where all you need is an internet connection, right? A computer. And like you could literally have a ton of connections, know millions of people, start a company, become world famous, become a billionaire. And you could do it without ever having to have an actual interaction. We're in a time where that's possible. So whenever you uncouple anything from anything else, the same thing happened with the Industrial Revolution, where it uncoupled, like machines brought the world right in front of us. So it uncoupled functioning from movement. Boom, you uncouple those things. And then we have this that transformed our relationship to our body. I think something at a basic level like that is happening with relationship. Now, when you do that with this, when you consider what these awkward things called relationships are, they're how we become people. We become people through them. And they're inherently messy. They're inherently uncomfortable. If you think about all all the possible things that could happen by you and I just engaging in a conversation. You could say something to me that I misunderstood that could hurt me so bad that I need therapy for 10 years, right? Or you could say something to me that could enlighten me, right? There's this range of possibilities that could happen in any interaction. And so that's inherently scary. So if you make it optional, right, our nervous systems are just going to do the easier thing, right? And I think we see that all over the place.
And that I thought was just so profound, because that is in fact what we are doing. People are easier to deal with when we can hang up the phone. And it's even easier when that Vanderclay guy is just so annoying. Unsubscribe! Yeah.
So I don't think I don't think that's the whole reason, right? Why dialectic and dialogos and everything that we're doing here. I don't think it's the whole reason, but I think it's a big reason why it's speaking to us, right? Because there's an intuition that we have that something is missing. And what's interesting is I just saw a series of papers come out about the epidemic of loneliness. And what's really interesting about the particular kind of loneliness that people are experiencing is it's a loneliness that they experience, but it's not a driver to go out in a relationship. It has them go further into isolation, right? Which is really striking to me. You would think, well, you're lonely, so you want to be around people. So like you'd be moved to do that, but you're lonely, but it's a kind of loneliness that actually does not presuppose to you to be driven to be around people. And so I think that
Before the internet thing, maybe it was just after it started, I did an adult education class because I had, again, I've mentioned this before, there was one therapist once told me, she said, you know, there's a world of books about how to get ready to have a baby. There's a world of books about what to do when you have a baby. There's a world of books about toddlers, grade school kids, high school kids, even some about college kids. There's like no books about when you're a parent of an adult. And so I decided to do a adult education class on parenting adult children, even though I was just at the cusp of it. And what I did was I went to my go-to, which is sort of agapic, that, and this is a really uncomfortable thing for us to admit, but almost anything worth doing in this world requires sacrifice. And in almost any relationship, the depth that the relationship can go is related to your capacity to suffer for the relationship and for the other person. Now that can become a really twisted thing, and a really masochistic thing, and that's not at all what I mean for it. But if you are unwilling to suffer, do not have a child. And a lot of people are deciding they're unwilling to suffer, they're not going to have a child. Okay. This is the point that C.S. Lewis made with respect to his heart. If you're going, and this is one thing Lewis figured out in the 20th century, if you wrap up your heart and keep it far away in a cold, dark box, it will shrivel. You have to bring it out into relationship and let it be hurt, and at least entertain that possibility. Now, maybe it won't be hurt in a very bad way. If that's true for you, you are blessed. Usually we get hurt. And it's what happens after you get hurt and your capacity to hang in there. And it doesn't mean you always have to stay together. It doesn't mean you have to be with a person who hurts you. But it's analogous to when Peterson talks about the fact that when people, the job of making people less anxious is to make them more brave. The job of growing your heart is to make you not have a harder shell, but to, in fact, have a stronger heart so that you can absorb the pain and still give in return. And of course, in Christianity, at the center of the faith is a man who is basically trying to overthrow the Roman Empire, which he will do, but not in any of the way that the Romans could understand. And as he's being crucified, he says, "Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing." He's asking that God forgive those who are executing him. It's an amazing thing. But that's what this is about.
There's a pathology going on, an underdevelopment going on with us that we only get through interaction and relationship that is become optional. And so I think that's a big part of it. That's one proposal I'll make around it.
And I thought, boy, that's one heck of a speech. There's another one in here that I want to grab.
Yeah, it occurs to me there's something about, you know, this transition or this new oncoming, you know, Gen Z, but also previous generations spending more and more time online. So maybe for Gen Z, there's a never knowing of what's possible. And then for the older ones, you know, getting Gen Y and into the Gen X and millennial.
And that touches on this, the fact that humanity is always sort of standing on the edge of a generational precipice, that which has been achieved at great cost can be lost, sometimes because of the achievement.
Millennials, there's a forgetting as well, like a forgetting of what that was like. Like maybe you had that when you grew up, but you know, the way that, you know, that happens as you go through school and you build a life, you sort of distance yourself, and then as the technology comes in, it creates a wider gap. So it occurs to me that the meaningless conversations are probably happening because there is a forgetting or there is a never knowing of what's possible. And therefore, when people are coming together, they're not making contact.
Mm-hmm.
They're talking past each other, or they're doing, you know, perhaps even worse, sort of engaging in more of a the religion of politics, the culture war sort of, and that's the engagement. And then it's just like, I don't want that. So it makes perfect sense, of why there would be that.
And, again, this is part of why I helped to start Estuary, because people don't know how to have a conversation. People don't know how to be in relationship with one another. And there's an intergenerational breakdown of this. I remember it was a situation where a child was in a very abusive relationship with her husband. And the mother and father of that child, it was an adult child, were saying, when you grew up, did you ever hear your father talk to your mother in anything like he's talking to you? No. And this was within my own extended family. And I immediately, when I heard that story, thought about my grandparents, Hiram and Grace, who, there's plenty of differences between Hiram and Grace. I remember visiting them in the nursing home when he was increasingly being hobbled by dementia, and would leave his socks on the floor, and it drove her crazy. And my grandmother, did not have a lot of patience, and my grandfather had a world of patience. I remember driving back from Grand Rapids to New Jersey in the car with them. This would be the last time they would take that trip by car because of their age. And I sat in the front with my grandfather, and my sister sat in the back with my grandmother, which drove my sister crazy. It's my sister who's passed away. Because my grandmother was just talk, and then she'd admonish my grandfather, oh, maybe Paul wants to have a nap right now, because, of course, we were the men, so we had to drive, and all this kind of stuff. And she would sit in the back seat and say, oh, hi, I'm a little warm. He'd reach over, turn up the air conditioning just a notch. 5 minutes later, oh, hi, now I'm a little cold. He'd reach over and adjust it just a notch. This went on for hundreds of miles, and I watched him and I thought, good grief, man. How can you do this? I'm at that point a college student, and my sister is a college student, and I'm just thinking, where do you have the patience to deal with this? I'm a little warm, I'm a little cold, I'm a little warm, put on a sweater, woman. I loved both of them dearly, and my grandfather had developed enormous patience and enormous kindness. And every day I'd visit them in a nursing home. I've told this story before too. He would always wear a shirt with a collar and a tie. And I remember my aunt who lived in Grand Rapids with them, my aunt telling my grandfather, I can get you some nice polo shirts or something that you don't have to wear a tie with. And I mean, this was 7 days a week wearing a tie. And he'd say, oh no, Grace likes me in a tie. So he would be uncomfortable 7 days a week wearing a tie because his wife liked the way he looked that way. And at that age, I don't think he was getting any extra sex for it or anything like that. He just loved pleasing his wife. And she had less patience. She was very sharp. She was very smart. She had a terrific memory, but she didn't suffer fools easily. And yet she loved him dearly. And I remember when he was in the casket. And I remember her just leaning over and kissing his cheek. And telling his cold body just how much she loved him. This doesn't just happen. These are achievements. And they're intergenerational achievements. Dallas Willard used to talk about the difference between training and trying. A lot of people will watch stories that inspire them on Netflix or YouTube or the internet, or they'll read them and they'll think, I want to love like that. You don't just achieve loving someone. I'm not talking about being loved. I'm talking about loving someone. You don't just achieve that by wanting it and trying it. You have to train for it. And you get trained for it from the ground up, from your childhood on. And now, again, some people John Vervaeke amazes me sometimes with his capacities. And he has won many of those capacities through a lot of training. I'll say it that way. But when you are raising up a child and when you are trying to become a good lover, and I don't mean that sexually, and I don't exclude sexuality from that or sexual performance from that, but when you are trying to become a good lover, someone who has the capacity to love, this is an intergenerational process. And so, I'll fill in this. So when my aunt was telling my cousin, you've never seen your father talk to me that way, the way your husband talks to you. This is not okay. And I'm not going to tell you what to do, but you're going to have to do something because you can't live like this and you shouldn't. And they eventually got divorced. And my cousin couldn't change her then husband according to that. And those costs continue to have to be borne. But part of what is happening as a culture, we are losing this capacity and this achievement among us, between us. That's a lot of this meaning crisis.
Step back into solitude. Yeah.
I think the way in which the emergence of social media, obviously there's a quantitative aspect that we've been talking about, but there's a qualitative aspect too that I think is really important, which is right? The idea, we have an idea of communing underneath communication as common union, as a process of continuing. We are the primates that have the longest childhood, and we have to go through cultural maturation, which is as significant as our biological maturation. And that process, and the idea that process, like, nobody ever says, well, I'm mature enough, I'm done. Right? And in fact, maturation is ongoing. And it's interesting, John Rusin talks about maturation as,
And it's also the case that the more mature you get, I mean, that's this whole knowledge paradox. The more you know, the more you realize you don't know. The more mature you get, the more you realize how stubborn your immaturities are.
Notice the language we use. It's a capacity to face, or to face up to reality. And it's the facing, right, which is an interpersonal thing. And that maturation is a process you catch agapically from other people, right? And so we have lost the person-making maturation function of communing because we have put such an emphasis on the quantity of information and how rapidly we can transmit it to each other. And so this has been a big refocusing of what the point of communication is. The point of communication is this pointless, how much information is being moved around such that the movement of the information can make different people wealthy or powerful. And that has lost out to, well, it's the T.S. Eliot, where's the wisdom we've lost in the knowledge, and where's the knowledge we've lost in the information, right? And so I think I'm not disagreeing that it has had these practical effects. And, I try to talk about this, about propositional tyranny, but the idea is there's this fundamental notion that we have lost the maturation person-making functions of, and we've lost layers of that. We had friendship, we still have friendship, although the number of true friends that people has been regularly declining. But we've completely lost the category of fellowship, which was a much more comprehensive co-commitment to person-making.
And again, when in church and the Christian Reformed Church, after someone was baptized, the whole congregation stands up, and that's what they promise to do, whether they pull it off or not. There's a lot that goes on into that, but that's that point of fellowship.
And so I think there's this overall move towards this diminished. So you can see a parallel thing in which, like, we talk about the horizontal and the vertical, right? And how they feed into each other. We've lost the contemplative sense of ratio as coming into right relationship with that which transcends us, and coming into right relationship with that which grounds us. And then we reduced it in Descartes. Ruchit spoke about how Descartes hated logos, and he proposed logic in its stead, right? And we reduced the contemplative to the computational. And then we're now witnessing that the computational isn't even for what it was for Descartes, trying to get the truth. The computational is now just the quantification of how much communication, and that's the only standard. It's the only number. So we've got this concomitant, right, reduction of ratio. We've got, right, a maturation of person making. And I think it means for us that we are losing ourselves as anything other than instrumental in nature. So when you lose communing, and when you lose contemplative ratio, you lose the sake of ratio for its own sake, or personhood for its own sake. If rationality becomes merely instrumental, if communication becomes merely instrumental, and we are the creatures of ratio communication, we are the creatures of logos, then we ultimately become merely instrumental. And I think that is a fundamental undermining of our capacity to be the intrinsically, inherently valuable and meaningful things that persons are. And I think that is fundamentally what's driving this in a really profound way. We are losing, not in some technical academic sense where we can give propositional definitions, but we are losing the existential deciding for oneself of being a person and the phenomenology of what that is in a deep and profound way.
So, yeah, the whole video is excellent. So I very much recommend it. And I think they're dead on right. We're losing our humanity. We are losing our image bearingness. In persons, I was writing a post for CRC Voices today, and part of the image bearing that we have from our Creator is, in fact, this quality, which I think, in terms of Christianity, is part of the reason for the Trinity, is this quality of, I've been married to my wife for 35 years. I have by no means exhausted her, and she has not exhausted me. Sometimes we find each other exhausting, but I have not gotten to the bottom of who she is, and she has not gotten to the bottom of who I am. Why? It's our image bearing, and it's deeply tied to this personhood, but our potential and capacity for achieving that is deeply tied to this agapic maturation. And it's both maturation done by agape, and it's also the capacity for agapic love and relationality towards others that creates it. In other words, all these videos now about demographic collapse, and if you listen to them, they talk about the fact that when it's all going this way, you have more people and more moms and more babies and more moms and more people and more babies, and population just goes like this. And then it starts going like this, and you realize, well, there's fewer women and fewer men and fewer couples and fewer babies, and then it just starts going like this. And so part of what we've seen is that we've started this trajectory, and broadly as a culture, if we lose this capacity, if we lose too much of this capacity, it's a loss of achievement, and it's very difficult to reverse the direction and the trend. So I thought this was a profound video, and these points made early on, I thought were absolutely profound and important. So I wanted to share them with you as part of the synthesis that I do. So watch both of these videos in their entirety, read the whole thing, watch the whole thing, and leave a comment. Let me know what you think.